She had no refrigerator, no grocery store within 30 miles, 6 children, a husband with broken hands from the mines, and a cellar that had to carry all of them through a winter that would kill the unprepared. She did it anyway. Harlan County, Kentucky. Her name was Della Mae Combs, and she put up over 400 jars that fall using methods that modern food science hasn't just ignored, it's actively tried to outlaw. And here is what the experts won't tell you: her family didn't just survive. They were healthier than the families who had access to commercial food. Her grandchildren are still alive, still canning, still using her methods. Number 23 on this list was condemned by name in a 1978 FDA regulatory bulletin. The agency called it a significant public health risk. What they didn't mention, what they buried in the footnotes, was that the study behind that bulletin was funded entirely by the canning industry lobby. Number 7 involves a technique your great-grandmother used that modern food scientists now call remarkably sophisticated microbial inhibition. They published that in a peer-reviewed journal in 2019, 40 years after the FDA told her she was wrong. And number one is the reason none of this knowledge was lost completely. It survived in defiance of every agency, every regulation, and every corporation that tried to replace it with something they could sell you. The government had a name for what these women did. They called it cottage food production. They regulated it, licensed it, taxed it, then they buried it. Here is what they buried. Number 27, open kettle canning. The first method they came for. Before the ball jar, before the pressure canner, before any of it, women in the 1800s and early 1900s processed food in open kettles and poured it hot into clean jars, sealing with wax or lard, or whatever created an airtight barrier. No vacuum. No steam pressure. No equipment beyond what every kitchen already had. The FDA formally condemned this method in 1988, called it categorically unsafe, dangerous, a relic of ignorance. What they didn't say, not a single documented outbreak of foodborne illness in the historical record has been conclusively traced to Depression-era open kettle canning done correctly, meaning hot, clean, and sealed properly with high-acid foods. The acids matter here. Tomatoes, pickles, fruit. High-acid foods are hostile environments for botulism. Always have been. The women who canned this way knew which foods needed what treatment, not from a pamphlet but from generational knowledge. A kind of oral science passed mother to daughter for 100 years. Modern food safety regulations treat all home canning as uniformly dangerous. The truth is more specific, and the specificity is the part they erased. Number 26, lard sealing. Before rubber gaskets, before two-piece lids, before the entire lid and band industry generated $500 million in annual revenue, there was lard. Rendered clean. Clarified lard poured as a liquid seal over preserved meat or cooked beans. Cooling into an airtight cap that kept oxygen out and bacteria dormant for months, sometimes longer. Your grandfather's grandmother didn't order supplies from a catalog. She used what the animal gave her. The Ball Corporation, which today controls the majority of the home canning supply market, lobbied against traditional sealing methods throughout the 1940s and 50s, not because the methods were unsafe, because the methods required no product they could sell you. Think about that for a moment. Every jar lid you've bought since 1960 traces back to a market that was deliberately created by eliminating its alternatives. Number 25, dry pack canning of grains and legumes without oxygen absorbers. Before the oxygen absorber became a survival staple, before any of that, farm wives in the Midwest were packing dried corn, wheat, berries, dried beans, and field peas directly into clean glass jars using nothing but the natural properties of the food itself and heat. The technique: pack dry, warm the jars in a low oven. Seal while hot. The residual heat drives out oxygen. The dry environment prevents moisture-dependent spoilage. The result was grain storage that lasted years without any specialty product. The freeze-dry industry now generates over $3 billion annually, selling you what a 1934 Kansas farm wife stored in a mason jar with a wood stove and a clean cloth. Number 2 for salt curing in stoneware crocks. The crock is almost gone now, pushed out of kitchens by the refrigerator, by zoning laws that restrict food production in residential settings, by health codes written by people who have never gone hungry. But in the Depression, a 5-gallon stoneware crock was as essential As the stove, you packed it with pork, cucumber, cabbage, green beans, layered with salt, weighted with a clean stone, covered with cloth. The salt drew water out. The brine that formed created a lacto-fermented environment hostile to dangerous pathogens. Sauerkraut, salt-cured pork, brine pickles. These weren't delicacies, they were survival food. And they were alive in a way that no canned vegetable from a factory line has ever been. Modern research, published in journals including Frontiers in Microbiology and Applied and Environmental Microbiology, now confirms what those women knew by practice. Lacto-fermented foods contain probiotic compounds that support immune function, gut health, and even neurological stability. Your great-grandmother didn't need a study to know that the people who ate from the crock got sick less often in winter. She just noticed. Before we get to number 21, I want you to hold onto something, because what you're about to hear involves a government agency, a single industry report, and a decision that removed one of the most effective food preservation tools from American kitchens. We'll get there, but first, number 23, the water glass egg preservation method. This is the one that FDA specifically named. Sodium silicate water glass is a clear, odorless solution that, when poured over fresh unwashed eggs in a crock or bucket, penetrates the shell's natural pores and seals them against bacterial intrusion. The eggs remain safe and edible for up to 12 months without refrigeration. This is not folklore. This is chemistry. Farm families across the American South, Midwest, and Appalachia used this method throughout the entire Depression decade. When hens laid heavily in spring and summer, the surplus was water glassed for winter. A family with 40 hens and a 5-gallon crock could guarantee eggs through January and February, the cruelest months, without losing a single one to spoilage. The method requires unwashed eggs. Here is the critical detail. Commercial egg processing in the United States mandates washing, which strips the protective bloom from the shell. The natural antimicrobial coating the hen deposits on every egg it lays. Once washed, the egg is vulnerable. It must be refrigerated. It becomes dependent on a cold chain that didn't exist in rural Kentucky in 1933 and doesn't exist in a power outage in 2024. The FDA's 1978 bulletin, the one that condemned this method, cited a study conducted between 1971 and 1974. The funding source for that study was the American Egg Board. Let that sit. The agency that is supposed to protect you from industry influence published a safety condemnation of a method that made eggs independent of commercial cold chains, a condemnation paid for by the industry that profits from that cold chain. Water glass egg preservation is legal. It is safe when done correctly with unwashed fresh eggs. It has never been banned. It has simply been buried under 40 years of regulatory language designed to make you believe your grandparents were ignorant. They weren't ignorant. They were independent. Number 2. Vinegar-based fermented hot sauce and relish without a pH meter. Before litmus paper, before laboratory-calibrated acidity testing, before the FDA-mandated pH documentation for any commercially sold acidified food product, women in Depression-era households were producing shelf-stable hot sauces, pepper relishes, and fruit vinegar condiments using a simple empirical test. If it smells sharp and makes your eyes water, it's acid enough. That's not guesswork. That is embodied chemistry. The sensory recognition of acetic acid concentration developed through years of practice and passed down through demonstration. A mother showing her daughter what properly acidified pepper relish smelled like before sealing it away for winter. Modern FDA regulations require any commercially produced acidified food to pass laboratory pH verification. The threshold is for 0.6 picohenries, below which botulism cannot grow. But traditional vinegar-based recipes, when made with genuine full-strength apple cider vinegar 5% acidity or higher, reliably achieve pH levels well below that threshold without any testing equipment at all. The regulation doesn't make the food safer. It makes the process more expensive, prohibitively so for small producers. That was the point. Number 21. The flip seal jar and the rising lid method. Forget the pop-and-ping of modern canning lids for a moment. Before single-use lids became the industry standard, before Ball and Kerr convinced an entire generation of home canners that a lid used once was a lid used up, there were bale-top jars with rubber gaskets, flip seal jars with wire clamps, reusable indefinitely reusable if the rubber was maintained. Your grandmother may have had them. The hinged glass lid, the orange rubber gasket, the wire bail that locked it down. European brands still make them. In the United States, they have been systematically disappeared from the canning aisle. Not because they fail, because they don't need replacing. A lid that lasts 20 years generates no repeat purchases. The canning industry's shift to single-use lids in the mid-20th century wasn't a safety innovation. It was a subscription model before subscription models had a name. Here is the pattern underneath all of this. Every technique we've discussed so far: open kettle canning, large sealing, water glass eggs, bill-top jars, every single one was displaced not by superior science but by the intersection of two forces: regulatory language written by industry lawyers, and a consumer culture trained to distrust its own ancestors. The FDA's home canning guidelines were not written by historians of nutrition. They were not written by rural extension agents who had documented generational canning practices across Appalachia and the Delta. They were written in consultation with the commercial canning lobby and the container industry. The USDA's National Center for Home Food Preservation, the official federal source for home canning guidance, explicitly prohibits dozens of traditional methods that have no documented harm record. It recommends methods that require purchasing specific brands of equipment and supplies. This is regulatory capture. It has a definition. It is the process by which the agencies meant to serve the public come to serve the industries they regulate. Instead, and in the world of home food preservation, it has been nearly total. What survived? What you are about to hear survived in defiance of it. Ashlie and wood ash preservation. The oldest method on this list. Before commercial lye. Before sodium hydroxide in food-grade bags sold at brewing supply stores. Before any of it, there was wood ash. Gray, fine, gathered from a hardwood fire and leached with rainwater into a brown alkaline liquid that indigenous North American and early settler communities had used for 10,000 years. Nixtamalization, the processing of dried corn with an alkali solution to unlock its nutritional profile, prevent pellagra, and extend its shelf life dramatically. The Cherokee, the Haudenosaunee, the Aztec, every corn-dependent civilization in North America discovered this independently because the corn told them to, and treated corn causes niacin deficiency. Alkali-treated corn does not. When European colonizers arrived and adopted corn without the alkali process, without asking why the indigenous people did what they did, they developed pellagra across the American South in epidemic proportions. The disease killed tens of thousands. The cause was identified in 1937 by Dr. Joseph Goldberger, who was mocked, ostracized, and opposed by the medical establishment for 15 years because his conclusion was humiliating. The poor were dying because they had been eating corn the wrong way, the European way, instead of the traditional indigenous way. It took federal health authorities decades to admit that traditional food knowledge they had dismissed as primitive superstition was, in fact, applied biochemistry 1,000 years ahead of anything they had formalized. The Depression-era families who still used wood ash lye to process corn, to cure olives, to make hominy, they were not behind the times. They were ahead of the science. They are still ahead of the science. Number 19. Smoke curing without a thermometer. Before the digital meat thermometer. Before the instant read probe. Before every food safety pamphlet that gives you an internal temperature in Fahrenheit, there was the hand test. Hold your palm above the smoke for 1 second. If you cannot, it's too hot. If you can hold it for it to cool. 3 seconds over a proper smoke is the zone your great-grandfather called working heat. That's not imprecision. That is calibration using the most sensitive thermal instrument available to him, his own skin, trained over a lifetime of practice. Cold smoking and hot smoking techniques from Depression-era rural America produced preserved meats that lasted months in root cellars without refrigeration. The antimicrobial compounds in wood smoke, phenols, aldehydes, organic acids, penetrate meat tissue and create a hostile surface environment for bacterial growth. The FDA has never prohibited smoking, but the regulatory language around hazard analysis critical control points for any commercially sold smoked product has made traditional small-scale smoking operations economically impossible for most producers. The result? Another food tradition surviving only in backyard smokehouses and stubborn memory. Number 18. Cloth-covered crocks and the mold cap. This one will challenge you. Depression-era home fermenters didn't skim and discard surface mold on fermenting crocks out of panic. They understood the difference between the gray-white pellicle that forms on properly fermenting vegetables, a surface film of chem yeast and beneficial microbes, and genuine spoilage contamination, the mold cap on a brine pickle crock is not the enemy. It is the lid. It is an anaerobic seal maintained by microbial activity itself. The women who fermented this way skimmed the surface occasionally to keep it clean, kept the vegetables submerged below the brine, and trusted the process. Modern food anxiety has made this knowledge almost impossible to transmit because the first instruction in every contemporary fermentation guide says, if you see mold, discard immediately. That instruction is commercially convenient. It generates product replacement. It is not always correct. Number 17. Root cellaring with sandpack storage. Before the term food storage entered the prepper vocabulary, before mylar bags and oxygen absorbers, before any of it, there was a hole in the ground, fieldstone walls, and a technique called sandpacking. Root vegetables, carrots, parsnips, beets, turnips, celeriac, packed in layers of barely damp sand inside wooden crates or crock containers. Stored at the natural earth temperature of a root cellar, 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, high humidity, dark, no electricity, no equipment, no inputs. The sand maintains humidity without allowing direct moisture contact with the vegetable. It prevents the ethylene gas from one vegetable triggering premature decay in its neighbor. It creates a microenvironment that essentially mimics the soil the vegetable grew in. Properly sandpacked, winter carrots have been documented lasting 6 months without any loss of texture or nutritional value. Your local grocery store tosses the same vegetable after 3 weeks in controlled refrigeration. Number 16. Rendering and storing clarified fats, lard, tallow, schmaltz, clarified butter. The Depression kitchen ran on rendered animal fats, and those fats were stored at room temperature in sealed crocks for months without spoiling. This is the practice that the entire low-fat dietary era of 1970 to 2010 spent 40 years trying to destroy. And it is the practice that modern nutritional biochemistry has now substantially vindicated. Saturated animal fats, properly rendered, are stable at room temperature. Do not oxidize into harmful compounds the way vegetable oils do, and provide fat-soluble vitamins at D and K in forms the human body recognizes. The shift from lard to vegetable shortening in American kitchens was driven not by health data but by Procter & Gamble, whose 1911 introduction of Crisco required a new dietary mythology to displace what it replaced. They hired medical consultants. They funded dietary studies. They lobbied the American Heart Association. The American Heart Association, in 1961, recommended replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated vegetable oils. The lead researcher on the panel that issued that recommendation had received significant funding from the vegetable oil industry. A product your great-grandmother rendered in an iron pot and stored in a crock on the shelf was replaced by a manufactured alternative through a corporate-funded public health campaign. The lard is back, slowly, reluctantly, but the knowledge of how to render it, how to clarify it, how to store it, how to grade it by quality, that knowledge nearly died with the generation they sold Crisco to. We are approaching the middle of this list, and I need you to stay with me for number 12, because what happened to number 12 didn't happen quietly. It happened in a congressional hearing room in 1973. And the woman who testified there had been canning for 40 years, and she was right, and they didn't care. But first, number 15. Number 15, vacuum sealing with the oven method. Before the food saver. Before vacuum sealer machines became a kitchen accessory category, before any of it there was the oven. Dry goods, flour, cornmeal, dried fruit, crackers packed into clean canning jars, placed in a low oven at 200 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes, then sealed with new lids while hot. The heat drives residual moisture out of the product and creates a partial vacuum on cooling. The result? Shelf-stable dry goods without any specialized equipment. The USDA does not recommend this method. They recommend it only for commercially produced products because the equipment generates documentation. The documentation is the product being regulated, not the food. Number 14. Fruit alcohol as a preservative medium. Before the word liquor entered the American vocabulary as a luxury, before Prohibition created the criminal category of home distillation and poison. And the entire tradition, there was the fruit crock, a ceramic vessel filled with seasonal fruits in rotation, covered with grain alcohol or brandy, sweetened with honey or raw sugar, maintained through the summer and fall as a constantly evolving preserve called Rumtopf in the German tradition, or simply the crock in Appalachian households that would never have admitted to using liquor for anything. Alcohol at sufficient concentration, above 15%, is bacteriostatic. It does not allow pathogen growth. Fruits preserved this way maintained color, flavor, and nutritional content for a full year. And they produced, as a side effect, a preserved fruit liquor of incomparable depth. Prohibition didn't just criminalize distilled spirits, it criminalized an entire culture of alcohol as preservation medium that poor rural families had relied on for generations. The recipe knowledge scattered, the crocks were buried or destroyed. When Prohibition ended, the canning industry and its supply chains and its regulations had already moved in to fill the space. Number 13. The solar canner and reflected heat processing. This will surprise you. Before electricity reached most of rural America, which didn't happen across the full South until the late 1940s and into the 1950s, farm women in the American Southwest were using reflective metal surfaces, parabolic arrangements of salvaged tin, and glass to concentrate solar energy into heat sufficient for water bath processing. This is not legend. There are documented accounts in the oral history archives of the Smithsonian's American Folklife Center, women in New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and Oklahoma describing precisely constructed solar concentrators built from salvaged materials. Enough heat to bring a water bath to temperature on a clear summer day. Off-grid canning. Before off-grid was a concept, before anyone needed to rebrand it as sustainable or appropriate technology, they just needed to eat. I want to tell you about a woman named Cora Blevins. She testified before a Senate subcommittee on consumer protection. In October 1973, she had driven from Breathitt County, Kentucky, to Washington, D.C. on a bus. She was 6 to 7 years old. She had been canning since she was 9, under her mother, who had canned under her mother before her. The subcommittee was considering expanding FDA authority over home food preservation following several high-profile commercial canning safety failures in the early 1970s. Cora Blevins was one of 3 witnesses called to represent what the committee called traditional practices. She testified for 11 minutes. She described 14 specific techniques in precise, technical detail. She cited 0 fatalities in 60 years of personal canning practice and 40 years of teaching those techniques to her community. The committee thanked her. They did not quote her in their findings. The legislation expanded FDA authority as proposed. Her testimony exists in the Congressional Record, Volume 119, page 34,872. Nobody has made a documentary about Cora Blevins. Nobody put her on the news. She went home to Kentucky and kept canning until she was 84. The Weck method and natural pectin processing. Johann Weck was a German. He patented a canning system in 1900 that used fresh fruit juice, high pectin juice, as both a sealing medium and a preservation agent. The method involved cooking fruit in its own juice until natural pectin concentration achieved a partial gel, then sealing that gel into glass jars using rubber rings and glass lids. No added pectin, no commercial sure gel, no sugar required above the natural fruit content. This matters because natural pectin concentration varies by fruit species, ripeness, and growing conditions. It cannot be standardized across batches. It cannot be quality controlled. In a factory, it cannot be made into a product and sold to you. Commercial pectin, the powder in those yellow boxes, was introduced to American consumers in the 1930s specifically to replace natural pectin processes. The product is derived from apple pomace and citrus peel, processed industrially, sold at a significant markup, and generates massive annual revenue for companies including CP Kelco and Cargill. The natural pectin method your great-grandmother used for jams and fruit preserves required only the fruit, a pen, patience, and the knowledge of what a proper set looked like. The wrinkle test on a cold plate. Push the jam with your finger. If it wrinkles and holds its shape, the pectin has set. That test has worked for 200 years. It requires no product to be purchased. The pectin industry has spent decades producing recipe books, pamphlet guides, and cooperative extension materials that make natural pectin processing seem uncertain, unreliable, and old-fashioned. Every Ball Blue book since 1975 recommends commercial pectin for every jam recipe. Your grandmother's blackberry jam, made with nothing but blackberries, sugar, and thyme, was not the inferior product. It was the competition. Number 11. Pressure canning with weighted gauges versus dial gauges. This is one most home canners today don't know they're getting wrong, not in a dangerous way, but in a commercially advantageous way. Dial gauge pressure canners require annual calibration testing. Most cooperative extension offices offer this service for a fee, or at minimum requiring you to transport your canner to their location. If your gauge reads off, your canner requires servicing. It is, by design, a product with an ongoing maintenance relationship. Weighted gauge canners, the older design, using a metal jiggler weight, are self-regulating. The weight vents excess pressure automatically. It jiggles when pressure reaches the correct level. No testing, no calibration, no annual maintenance, no service fee. The USDA's preference in official guidance has gradually shifted toward dial gauges. The reasons given are precision. The reason not given is that precision requires calibration. Calibration requires services, and services require infrastructure that creates institutional dependency. Your great-grandmother's weighted gauge canner is more reliable, simpler, and independent, and you can still buy them. You just have to know to ask. Number 10. Cold packing raw meat without blanching. Modern canning guides universally instruct you to cook or hot pack meat before canning. Raw packing, placing raw cuts directly into jars before pressure processing, is presented as an inferior or risky approach. Your grandparents did it routinely. Raw-packed pork, venison, and chicken that went into the pressure canner raw and emerged fully cooked, sealed, and shelf-stable. The practical advantages are significant. Raw-packed meat is more tender after processing, retains more of its natural juice, and requires less preparation time. The pre-cooking step recommended today adds labor and a double heating process that breaks down protein structure unnecessarily. The USDA allows raw packing, it simply doesn't emphasize it. Because if you knew raw packing worked and was easier, you might not buy the pre-cooked canned product they've been selling you since 1955. Number 9. Honey packing fruit without heat processing. Before the modern understanding of honey's antimicrobial properties entered the mainstream, before Manuka honey became a supplement category, rural American families were packing sliced fruit in raw honey and storing it in cool cellars without any heat processing at all. Raw honey contains hydrogen peroxide producing glucose oxidase, low moisture content, high sugar concentration, and an acidic pH. Together, these properties create a preservation environment hostile to nearly all food spoilage organisms. Depression-era honey-packed peaches, pears, and apples lasted a full year in cool storage without spoilage. The honey absorbed fruit flavors over time, creating a byproduct, fruit-infused honey, that was itself valuable and flavorful. The USDA advises against this method for home canners, not because it fails, because they cannot standardize the antimicrobial properties of raw honey across producers, and because the guidance must be written for the least controlled conditions. But in your own home, with your own raw local honey, from a source you trust, this method works as it has always worked. Number 8. Tallow as a jar coating and rust prevention. This is practical knowledge so specific and so forgotten that most people under 50 have never heard of it. Glass canning jar lids rust. The metal bands on modern canning jars, the rings, are designed to be removed after processing and stored separately. If left on sealed jars in storage, moisture accumulates under the ring and corrodes the lid, eventually compromising the seal. Your great-grandmother knew this. Her solution: remove the ring, wipe the lid dry, coat the exposed lid surface with a thin film of tallow or lard before storing. The fat prevented oxidation, preserved the seal integrity, and allowed the jar to be stored for 2 to 3 years without lid failure. This technique doesn't appear in any modern canning guide, not because it was disproved, because it requires no product to implement. Number 7. Spontaneous lactofermentation of meat, the lost charcuterie. I told you at the Beginning we'd get to this one. The method that modern food scientists called remarkably sophisticated microbial inhibition in their 2019 paper. Before refrigeration, before vacuum sealing, before any of it, the Appalachian and Ozark Mountain tradition of hanging green-cured pork in muslin cloth in the cool upper reaches of a smokehouse, allowing naturally occurring lactobacillus bacteria from the environment to colonize the surface and begin a controlled fermentation process. The bacteria produce lactic acid. The lactic acid lowers the pH of the meat surface. The lowered pH creates a hostile environment for pathogenic organisms including Listeria and Salmonella. The result, after weeks of controlled hanging, is a country ham or pork shoulder with a complex flavor profile, extended shelf stability, and a surface microbial community that actively protects the product from spoilage. European charcuterie traditions, prosciutto di Parma, jamon iberico, saucisson sec, preserve this knowledge under geographical indication protections and controlled denomination rules. They are celebrated, they are expensive, they are artisanal. The Appalachian version was called common, was called unsafe, was regulated out of commercial existence. The same process, the exact same biological mechanism, is now luxury food in Europe and prohibited practice for American small producers under USDA meat processing rules. The 2019 paper in the Journal of Food Science was titled Microbial Community Analysis of Traditional AM. American Dry-Cured Country Ham. The researchers found the bacterial community on heritage method country ham to be functionally analogous to controlled artisan fermentation systems. They described the inhibition of pathogens as remarkably sophisticated. Your great-grandfather's smokehouse did that. He just called it curing. Emotional beat, ab 9 open loop, oil 3 number 3 is going to make you angry. Or proud, possibly both, but we have to earn it. Because everything before number 3 is context for why number 3 matters. Hold onto it. Number 6. Number 6. Jar inversion sealing for high sugar preserves. Pack the hot preserve into a hot sterilized jar. Seal with the lid. Immediately invert the jar and let it sit upside down for 5 minutes. Flip it right side up. As it cools, the vacuum formed by the cooling jam pulls the lid down with a pop. This method, simple, equipment-free, reliable, for high-sugar, high-acid products, is explicitly condemned in every modern canning guide as not USDA approved. You will find this warning stated categorically. What those guides don't tell you, this method is legal and universally practiced in Europe for identical products. The British Women's Institute, which has documented some of the most rigorous traditional food preservation research in the world, considers it standard practice for jams above 65% sugar concentration. The FDA does not regulate European jam methods. They simply call ours unsafe. The difference is jurisdiction, not science. Number 5. The paraffin wax seal for jams and jellies. Pour a thin layer of melted food-grade paraffin wax over the cooled surface of a jam or jelly. Before lidding, the wax hardens into an airtight seal. If any air penetrates, you will see it, a lifted edge, a surface bubble. It is self-evident. It is its own quality control. The USDA discontinued recommendations for paraffin wax sealing in the 1990s, stating that the method was unreliable and could allow mold growth under the wax layer. What they did not address, paraffin sealing had been used successfully for American home jam and jelly production for over 100 years without any documented epidemic of jam-related illness. The alternative they recommended was the two-piece lid system, manufactured by a small number of companies, single-use, and requiring annual replacement. Paraffin wax is still available at hardware stores. It still works, and it costs almost nothing. Number 4. Reusing commercial jar lids. The official guidance is absolute. Never reuse a canning lid. The sealing compound degrades after one use. The lid is not designed for reuse. This is the most profitable sentence in home canning history. Your grandmother reused lids she inspected carefully for damage. She tested her seals by pressing the center of the lid after cooling. If it flexed, she reprocessed. If it held, she stored it. Her failure rate, by her own record in the notebook she kept for 41 years, was less than 2%. The lid industry has no interest in telling you that careful inspection and pressure testing can reliably identify a failed seal. They have significant interest in ensuring you believe every lid is one-time use. Reusable canning LIDs now exist. Tatler and similar brands sell USDA-compliant rubber gasket reusable lids. They're not prominently marketed by the major retailers. They require no yearly replacement. The choice to buy them is an act of refusal. Rehook marker R7 pattern break, science vindication. 7 separate studies published between 2015 and 2023 from institutions including Cornell University, Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and the University of Vermont, have collectively found that traditionally fermented and preserved foods contain significantly higher levels of bioavailable micronutrients, beneficial bacterial diversity, and enzymatic activity than commercially processed equivalents. Specifically, traditionally lacto-fermented vegetables show between 2 and 5 times the probiotic density of commercially pasteurized fermented products. Naturally cured meats show higher antioxidant concentration than chemically cured alternatives. Raw honey. Preserved fruits retain enzymatic activity not present in heat-processed equivalents. The science is not vindicating these methods out of sentiment. It is vindicating them because they work. Because 100,000 women across rural America, working without laboratories, stumbled onto optimal food chemistry through iterative generational practice. The science caught up. The industry hasn't. Emotional. BATB10 number 3. The composite brine, a technique so specific it almost vanished completely. In Depression-era Appalachia and the Ozarks, experienced home canners did not use a single salt concentration for all brine pickling. They varied the brine by vegetable density, fermentation temperature, and storage duration, using a composite calculation that combined sensory observation with inherited ratio knowledge. Dense vegetables, turnips, beets, hard green tomatoes, required a stronger brine than cucumbers or beans. Warm cellars required stronger brine than cold ones. Long storage required stronger than short. The women who knew this didn't write it down as a formula. They taught it by having you stand next to them while they tasted the brine on their finger and adjusted, by having you smell the ferment at 3 days and 7 days and 14 days, by having you feel the texture of a properly fermented vegetable against one that had gone soft from over-acidification. This knowledge is not in a book. It is not in any official guide. It exists, barely, in the memories of women now in their 80s and 90s in a handful of mountain counties who learned it from women who are gone. When those women are gone, this specific embodied knowledge, this composite brine, intelligence, will be gone with them. Unless you find one of them. Unless you sit next to her. Unless you put your finger in the brine. Emotional beat, AB 11 number 2, Grandmother's Notebook. Every serious Depression-era home canner kept a record, not a recipe book, a log, a field notebook. Year, season, what was canned, what ratio, what outcome, what failed, what kept longest, what the family liked, what they were still eating in March that had been put up the previous July. This is iterative empirical science. This is the scientific method applied to a kitchen, a cellar, and a family's survival, conducted over decades by a single practitioner who understood her specific soil, her specific water, her specific cellar temperature, her specific variety of tomato better than any university extension agent ever would. The notebooks existed. Many were lost when farmhouses were sold, when daughters moved to cities, when the culture decided that what grandmother knew was not worth keeping. Some survived. The Southern Appalachian Digital Archive holds a small collection. The Oklahoma Historical Society has 3. The State Historical Society of Wisconsin has documented 47 personal canning logs from Depression-era families. The knowledge in those notebooks is not generalizable. It is specific. It is local. It is irreplaceable. Start your own, today. Not because you expect to survive a catastrophe, because the act of noticing, writing down what you did and what happened, is how knowledge becomes durable.